Welcome to the Polaris MEP Cybersecurity webinar sponsored by NERDIC. I'm Erin Reed and I am with Polaris MEP. Let you know a few housekeeping things before we get started. Number one, this video is being recorded. This webinar is being recorded. Number two, we are keeping everybody on mute so that we can hear our presenters clearly, and with video down just so we can maintain some privacy and cybersecurity. So Jean, if you can get us started.
Sure. So
we need to go one forward on the slide.
Thank you.
Gotta love technology and how we do this. So you will see that I am going to continue to kind of stop folks' videos and mute them as we go, just to make sure it's all real nice and tight for everybody to be able to hear and understand. So as I said, this is a Polaris MEP webinar and it's sponsored by NERDIC. Polaris MEP is the only nonprofit consultancy that is committed and dedicated to helping manufacturers in the state of Rhode Island grow. And we are part of the NIST MEP network. And that is a national network of manufacturing extension partnerships that all work to help manufacturers be more competitive, be sustainable, and really thrive and grow. Today's presentation, which is all about cloud computing under DFARS, is sponsored by NERDIC. And if you could show us the next slide, Jean. I feel like we're talking to Vanna White. NERDIC. NERDIC is the New England Regional Defense Industry Collaboration. And it is a partnership. That partnership is of not only companies that are within the state economic development organizations, but also MEPs such as the Rhode Island MEP, Polaris. And our entire goal for this partnership is to support those companies who are working within the Department of Defense supply chain to make sure that we are maintaining or growing our business within that group. So it is my pleasure, if we advance one more, Jean, we'll get you going, to introduce our cybersecurity expert for Polaris MEP, Jean Lehman. Jean helps our Rhode Island manufacturers and also companies throughout New England navigate the Department of Defense DFARS and also the NIST cybersecurity guidance. And Jean is going to take it from here and make sure that we're off to a great start. Jean?
Thank you, Erin. So this morning we're going to talk about cloud computing under DFARS-7012 and resolving this common obstacle on the path to CMMC. So cloud computing can be a sticky wicket, and this is intended to eliminate that a little bit for you. In that we do have a lot of folks from last week on, and we have a bit of news today. I'm going to start very briefly to let you know that the interim rules, the new interim rules for DFARS cybersecurity and safeguarding information have been published. The interim rule is effective in 60 days. It was just published this morning and there was a preview yesterday. So in a nutshell, it adds 3 new DFARS clauses that are listed here. And what it does is it basically codifies the current DoD assessment methodology or assessments into DFARS as well as the CMMC. So it will require you to have a current DoD assessment on record in order to be considered for an award. And to this purpose of this is to assess contractor compliance with implementation of the cybersecurity requirements and to enhance protection of unclassified information in the DoD supply chain. I want to highlight a couple of points from the 90 pages that I have not yet read all of. They have a point here which they're actually encouraging you to immediately conduct and submit a self-assessment. So that's a new suggestion. And if anybody's got any questions on that, you can give me a ring and I'm happy to chat with you about it. And likewise, hammering this home, if you haven't already started working on compliance with DFARS 7012 and working on implementing the NIST 800-171 requirements, They have basically said anybody who hasn't fully implemented basic safeguarding requirements under the FAR clause or the SP 800-171 requirements under DFARS begin correcting these deficiencies immediately, because these are things that should already have been implemented as to the FAR basic safeguarding, or you should at minimum have your plans of action to correct deficiencies for the DFARS requirements. So with that, let's talk about cloud. One of the biggest sticking points for cloud is the equipment provision under the cyber incident reporting. That tends to be where most cloud services trip. And today we have Jeff Williams with us. He is the cybersecurity program manager for Michigan Manufacturing Technology Center, and he leads the center's cybersecurity team efforts to educate and equip small and medium-sized manufacturers to guard against the growing threat of cyber attacks. Jeff has more than 20 years of experience in implementing and supporting network systems, including servers, workstations, and infrastructure components. One of his main areas of focus relates to cybersecurity requirements outlined in this special publication 800-171, designed to protect the information security systems of contractors working with the Department of Defense. So Jeff, with that, I am happy to turn it over to you.
Good morning. So as Jean said, this morning we're going to talk about cloud computing as it pertains to the DFARS requirements or the cybersecurity requirements. We're also going to touch briefly this morning on why cloud computing is popular and what from a DoD perspective is classified as cloud computing. So to start with briefly, as we know, cloud computing is something that's fairly popular. We see an example here of the world of cloud, we'll call it. And the idea behind cloud computing is that it allows for easy access of various entities from multiple locations without having to have the infrastructure locally. We see various examples of databases or servers or file objects. All of these fall within the definition of cloud computing. Why do people use cloud computing? Well, ultimately, as we mentioned, there's a lot of different reasons in a lot of different ways. And we've got some examples listed here of the different types of cloud computing we find, as well as some common service providers that we see. Servers, for example. Many people have heard of Amazon EC2 or Azure, DigitalOcean. These are all services that users can stand up rapidly and easily manage and deploy full servers without having to have the infrastructure locally within their environment. Storage is another common one. And a lot of times we don't think about the storage that we're using as being cloud computing, but it really is. Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive, those are all examples of storage. But so is Apple iCloud or even Office 365. These can also be examples of cloud-based storage. Databases, Amazon Cloud databases, Azure databases. Again, these are common forms of cloud services. And one of the more common ones that we also see in this day and age is software or applications. Hosted ERP systems is becoming very popular in regards to cloud computing. The websites that we have, most people do not host their websites internally. They host them on some sort of cloud service. Or even Office 365. It's virtually impossible in this day and age to have a completely standalone version of Office. It's connected to some sort of Office 365 or something similar to that nature. And there's a lot of advantages to cloud. Pay as you go. If I do not need a server or an application, I can shut it down, which lowers my cost. Flexible resources. If I need more storage space or if I need more processing power, in most of these applications, it's a minor charge or a reconfiguration to increase that to whatever I need to have my current needs fit. Little or no infrastructure costs. That's a huge one, especially in a lot of businesses that do not have an internal IT department, or they do not have updated modern equipment, or whatever reason they don't. It's a lot cheaper in most circumstances to be able to pay for a cloud service than it is to try to buy the equipment to hold it locally or own it yourself. And then obviously there's low maintenance and administration costs. If I'm using a cloud ERP, or if I'm using cloud storage, I don't necessarily have to worry about patches and updates, or worry about configuration on how is the server secure. All of that's handled for us. We simply need to create accounts and drop files up there. A lot of advantages and a lot of attraction toward cloud and cloud computing in general. But when it comes to compliancy and security, there's some additional configuration or additional considerations that must be taken when we talk about cloud. Now, the first thing that we really want to specify is when we think about cloud, or when we think about compliancy, especially as it pertains to DFARS, our mind immediately goes to NIST 800-171. That's where we find the requirements that we need to implement, the security measures we need to have in place. However, NIST 800-171 deals exclusively or virtually exclusively with equipment that we own that's on our premise. Cloud computing is not necessarily considered within NIST 800-171, at least not to the level that DFARS itself requires. So from that aspect, DFARS specifies special requirements and conditions if you're going to use cloud computing. And we can see that in the specific clause 2-2-D, where it states that if a contractor intends to use an external cloud service provider to do what? To store, process, or transmit any covered defense information, then we have to do something. There's additional considerations to be remaining compliant as it pertains to cloud. And we're going to talk about primarily 2 to 3 specific classifications that fall under here. The first one is a technical requirement, very similar to NIST 800-171. DFARS specifies that the contractor shall require and ensure that the cloud service provider meets security requirements equivalent to those established by the government for a FedRAMP moderate baseline. Well, what does that mean? What is FedRAMP? What's equivalent mean in this? Well, if you're unfamiliar with it, FedRAMP is a system that the government has established that provides a standard approach, a standard auditing methodology, a standard certification methodology for the security requirements that are specific and unique to cloud-based services. They have this specified at 3 different primary levels. There's FedRAMP low, moderate, and high. Now, in the situation as we just mentioned, DFARS specifies a FedRAMP moderate condition. Now, there's definitely benefits to FedRAMP. If we look here at the timeline, we can see that there is a full process that an agency needs to go through for their software to even get to the point of it being authorized or approved to be FedRAMP, moderate, low, or high. And we're going to look at some of these specifically because we need to understand what it means to be moderate or to be FedRAMP moderate approved or equivalent. These are terms that we ultimately have to understand. So if I was to look for a FedRAMP moderate equivalent, what does that mean? Well, as I said initially, FedRAMP does have a full approval process. You can go to their website, you can look for vendors that are approved at a specific level, and it will tell you that this vendor for this service is approved at this level. That's the best way of doing it, to be able to utilize a vendor that's already approved. Then you don't have to worry about equivalency. However, what if you're using a service provider that maybe they haven't gone through the process, or maybe they're just beginning, or for whatever reason, they can't afford to pay for full authorization? Well, what do we need to worry about from an aspect of that? What does equivalent mean? So let's take a look here, and we'll see the process that a provider has to go through to get to the point of becoming FedRAMP authorized. So the first step is they have to be established. What they're selling you, what they're using has to already be put in place. They have to then develop a system security plan and security controls very similar to the ones that we're required to do under DFARS in NIST 800-171. Now, after that, it is recommended that they actually go through an assessment readiness process that FedRAMP has to validate whether or not they're at a good baseline. The second thing that they need to do is they actually have to have a full external assessment done by an authorized organization. So their completed system security plan is taken, it's reviewed, and then it's approved by this external organization. When that external organization does that, they also perform a full security assessment, not only against that plan, but against also what the company has specified. For anything that they find there's an issue, they develop a plan of actions. Now, does any of this sound familiar? This is very similar to the process that DoD wants companies and organizations to do for their internal services, is what is expected of the cloud service. Now, the third phase is the actual authorization process. And an equivalent organization doesn't necessarily have to go through that. But what is important then is the fourth phase, that for an organization to stay authorized, they have to continuously or periodically review and update their plan of actions and security plans. And then they also are required to annually redo that security assessment to make sure that nothing has changed in regards to that. Now, why do we go through all of this? Why did I just list all of these? The reason for this is it helps us to establish an idea of what kind of security measures a web or a cloud service provider needs to have in place in order to be able to be classified as an equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. If you were talking with your service provider and maybe they wanted to offer cloud, web hosting, if you asked them when was the last time they performed a security assessment, could they show the results of that? Do they have a system security plan? What type of items are outstanding on their plan of action? They can't answer any of that, or if they come back and say, yeah, we got it, it's good, chances are they're probably not to a position that they can say they truly are equivalent to what FedRAMP moderate has. Now, I will also tell you this. There is a reason that a lot of organizations do not become FedRAMP authorized. It's not easy to do. The security requirements are very detailed. They're very in-depth. And it takes a lot of time and processing before they even get to the point that they're thinking about being authorized. Most organizations don't want to go through all of that. So chances are they are not in a situation where they actually are FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. Now, the other aspect about this that I will mention is if we jumped back, why is this important to you? Well, take a look at the first section of the specifications and requirements. The contractor, that is you as organizations, shall require and ensure that the cloud service provider meets these requirements. It is your obligation to make sure that they're at that point. If an incident occurs in a cloud-based system and the DoD comes to ask for more information, and you say, well, it happened in my cloud provider, and then they find out that the cloud provider is not appropriately handling security, who is the DoD going to fault for that? Well, obviously, they'll probably fault the cloud provider a little bit, but it's you as a contractor that's ultimately responsible. You as a contractor is the one who's going to get the repercussions of that. Now, once a cloud provider has either been authorized or has an equivalent system in place, there's another step they have to take. And this second step is the one that pretty much disqualifies the majority of cloud-based services from being truly DFARS compliant. And that deals with the incident reporting requirements within DFARS. So the second portion under the cloud settings says that a contractor shall require and ensure, again, you are responsible for this, that the cloud service provider complies with the requirements for incident reporting in paragraphs C through G of this clause. Now, you probably are aware that under DFARS, you have to make or have the capability of making incident reports. What is C through G? What's that specify? Well, let's take a look. The first one, rapidly report incidents. That's the common one that we see. Most people, that's when they think of incident reporting in DFARS, that's what they think of. Reporting of malicious software, that's another common one. But the last three are the ones that really get tricky when it deals with cloud. Media preservation and protection. So if we look over this, when a contractor discovers a cyber incident has occurred, the contractor shall preserve and protect images of the affected systems. That includes cloud-based systems. Does your cloud provider allow, and are they willing to give you images of the systems that they had that were compromised? If they don't, or if they don't keep those for 90 days, then they are not in compliancy with Clause E. What about what else? Clause F, access to additional information or equipment. Now, this one is the one that really gets most cloud providers. They do not want to do this. Upon request by the DoD, the contractor shall provide the DoD with access to additional information or equipment that is necessary to correct forensic analysis. What does that mean? That means that the DoD has the right to come into an organization that had an incident and say, we want to take and analyze for ourselves your servers, your hard drives, your images. Now, can you imagine the DoD going to a small web service company or a small cloud service company and say, give us your servers so we can do investigation? Most cloud service providers do not want that. They will not honor that. That is one of the biggest ones that causes problems for cloud service providers. Now, under damage assessment, if the DoD elects to conduct a damage assessment, contracting officer will request that the contractor provide all of the damage assessment information gathered. Now, that doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal, but let's think back to various cyber incidents that have occurred in the past. And the most common issue with them is the fact that a thorough investigation or a thorough assessment of why the incident occurred, what they did to identify and stop it, and what they did to protect the systems going forward has not been done. Cloud service providers have their own methodology of diagnosing this information, but they may not want to share that information with the DoD. Maybe it shows that they're not doing as much as they like to say they are. Or maybe they weren't as thorough as they thought they were. Or maybe they just were more worried about restoring services and not investigating what actually occurred. But if a cloud service provider is going to be compliant with the DFARS requirements, that's something that they need to be willing to do. Now, the other aspect about this, and we'll reiterate this again, is the aspect that you as a contractor are responsible and liable. It's your responsibility to make sure that this is happening. So then what can you do? I need a cloud service. What should I ask? What should I look for? How do I know if my provider is willing to be DFARS compliant? So if we take a look at the 3 questions that we have here, actually, I'm sorry, I think we skipped ahead somehow. We did. Let's backtrack a minute. The third aspect, we had our technical requirements. We had incident reporting requirements. But the third aspect is in DFARS Clause M, which is the flow down requirements. And within that, it says, you as a contractor shall include this clause, including all of paragraph M and in subcontracts or similar agreements for operational critical support or for which the contract performance will involve covered defense information. Now, what does that mean? If you are storing, processing, or transmitting covered defense information on a cloud system, its performance directly relates to covered defense information. That means that your cloud provider and you need to have a flow down agreement in place. Now, I don't know about you, but I have not worked with a lot of service providers who are willing to sign an agreement that I send to them. They want to send me an agreement and sign, but if I turn around and said, great, I'm willing to do this, but you know what? I'm going to give you an agreement that has flow down security requirements that is going to bind you to the DFARS obligations. Will you sign those? Usually the answer is no, we won't. But in order to be fully covered and DFARS compliant, they need to. That's something that you should validate. So now, what should you look for? What should you think of when you're looking at this? So take a look at just the 3 questions that we have here. And these are things that you should ask yourself, but as well as ask your potential cloud provider. Can the service provider provide evidence of a FedRAMP moderate equivalent security posture? If you ask them to prove that they are equivalent to FedRAMP moderate, can they do that? And an answer is yes, isn't sufficient. How can they prove it? What evidence can they give you so that you can tell the DoD, I assured that they were FedRAMP moderate equivalent? Can the service provider ensure that they comply with the incident reporting requirements in C through G? Again, most providers will say yes, but you really go through it on a line-by-line level, do they? Will they provide you with a piece of paper that says yes? Now, with a lot of services that do actually honor this, there's usually a separate addendum or separate agreement to the contract that says, we will honor the incident reporting requirements required by DFARS in section C through G. That can again be put on file, so if DoD asks for that information, you have it. And then finally, the last one, which is probably the most difficult one, is the service provider willing to sign an agreement for flow down? If they are unwilling to do so, then you are not fully DFARS compliant if you're using that cloud service provider. And it's a good question to ask early in the negotiations. Great, I want your service, I like your service. You have proven to me that you're FedRAMP moderate. You say that you comply with the incident reporting requirements. So if I send you a flow down agreement, will you sign it? If they say yes, then that is a valuable cloud service provider because they meet the DFARS requirements. But now let's look how a few common different providers affect this in a different way. Or let's look and see how this type of thing occurs. We're going to look at the example of Microsoft, and we're going to look at Microsoft 365 in general. Now, licensing with Microsoft can be complicated. However, if we look at the 4 primary elements that they have, commercial offerings, that's what anybody can buy, and that's what most people have. They also have what they refer to as the GCC, or the Government Contracting Cloud. Then they have a GCC High, which has a higher level of security. And then finally, a GCC or a DoD, which you have to actually be a member of DoD to be a part of that. But let's look at what most people have. Commercial. This is I signed a license with Microsoft. My email is hosted there. I use SharePoint Online. I use Dynamics 365 for my ERP system. If I have a commercial offering only, am I compliant with DFARS? Well, let's look. Well, Microsoft specifically spells it out. DFARS 252-204-7012. Is it compliant? No. Why not? Well, there's several reasons. One, can I store CUI or CDI there? No, I can't. They do not honor, or they do not have protection levels in place for that. Well, how about how they're doing with this 800-171? Well, they list maybe. Why do they list maybe there? Well, they list maybe because they say it depends on the type of information you're trying to store. And if we looked up, for example, to say ITAR, they say no, you can't store ITAR data when we remain compliant with the commercial environment. Now, in addition to that, are they willing to sign requirements or flow down agreements at that level? No, they're not. They don't even say that they're even thinking about it. It just flat out says no regarding DFARS. However, take a look at the accreditation section, 3rd line down. They are FedRAMP moderate. In fact, the GCC setting is also FedRAMP moderate. So from that perspective, they're a good match, but they do not honor the remainder of the incident reporting and contractual requirements for DFARS. Well, how about the second one there? M365 or GCC. Well, are they compliant with DFARS? Yes. Great, that's a good option for us, right? Well, no. Take a look at the clause bracket in there. No flow downs. So do they honor the incident reporting requirements? Yes. Are they FedRAMP moderate? Yes. Will they sign an agreement from you that says that they will honor the flow down requirements of DFARS? No, they will not. So in that situation, the GCC is also not DFARS compliant. We jump up now to GCC High, DFARS, yes, with flow downs. At that level, they're willing to sign an agreement from you that honors the flow down requirements. Can I store CUI, CDI there? Yes. Are they fully NIST 800-171? Yes. Are they at least FedRAMP moderate? Yes. In fact, they're FedRAMP high. So if you were looking at utilizing Microsoft 365, which again includes Office 365, Dynamics 365, SharePoint, OneDrive, email, Outlook, whatever the case may be, if you're going to store, transmit, or process covered defense information, in order to be compliant, you need to at least be in the GCC high category. Now, is that something that's easy to do? No, it's not. It's more expensive. You have to have special approval. You have to go through an authorization and background check and all sorts of additional requirements to get into GCC High. Now, this is just one example. There's other examples out there. Let's look at Google. That's another common one. Is Google compliant with DFARS? Absolutely not. In fact, Google specifically says that yes, we're FedRAMP moderate, but don't even think about storing ITAR or CUI within our systems. No, we will not sign any agreement from you. They are not a valid choice. Usually, if you're going to get into a cloud-based system, they usually will have some sort of agreement that's their Gov cloud. Now, Microsoft calls it a Gov cloud. Box.com, for example, a file sharing service, they have a Gov cloud. Amazon has a Gov cloud. Now, I'll tell you this, the minute you throw the word Gov in front of that cloud, your cost for that service is going to increase significantly. Now, what about the future? As Gene said, CMMC is coming. It's going to be rolled within the clauses of DFARS that it's a requirement. How does that affect us? Well, let's just look real quick at some of the differences between current obligations under DFARS and obligations under CMMC. So if we say that, well, technical requirements from NIST 801, or the technical requirements, for DFARS, it's NIST SP 800-171. CMMC has its own, which is based off of NIST 800-171. Well, what about implementation? Do they have to have everything implemented, or can they only have some things implemented? Well, under DFARS, you don't have to have everything fully implemented. You have to have it identified and a goal for full implementation. However, CMMC requires a full implementation. How about incident reporting? Well, contractually speaking, under DFARS, you have clause C through G. CMMC itself does not have any sort of incident reporting requirements. That falls under the DFARS side. But if we look at the concept of maturity, DFARS doesn't have any real maturity concepts, but CMMC does. So what does that mean? Well, let's take another common look. And this one is specifically toward Google. And it deals specifically toward the implementation and maturity components here. So Google had an assessment done by a common large company that does security as its primary business, Coalfire. So when Coalfire went through the assessment of Google systems, they said that even though Google was FedRAMP moderate, when they compared them against the requirements of NIST 800-171, they found deviations. The Google services did not limit unsuccessful login attempts by default. Privacy and security notices weren't consistent with what CUI required. They did not enforce minimum password complexity, and most specifically, they didn't mark any sort of information that stored CUI. Now, why are we saying that? We already said that Google wasn't an option. But using this comparison and then looking at the requirements under CMMC, as well as the maturity aspect, would a service provider that is fully compliant under DFARS be compliant under CMMC? And the answer is not necessarily. So when we start planning our cloud service providers for both today and tomorrow, we want to make sure that they're flexible enough that when we are under DFARS requirements, they work for us. But then when we go to CMMC, they also work for us. Now, the maturity side of things, you might be thinking, what's he talking about? Why is that important? From the aspect of maturity within CMMC, it looks at how mature are your and your provider's cyber practices. What are they doing? Are they actively looking to improve? Are they constantly reviewing? Are they constantly analyzing? So if you were to go to a CMMC maturity component and you pointed out that your cloud provider failed to observe the following deviations within NIST 800-171, they had no thoughts to improve upon that, you're still going to use them anyway because they work under DFARS. Does that show a maturity? Does that show the assessors evaluating your system that you're taking the requirements seriously and that you're always trying to improve upon them? More than likely, the answer is no, it does not. So the fact that your cloud service provider may fall short, or you may not know where they fall, that could potentially cause you to come in at a lower level of CMMC than what you ultimately required. So with all of that in mind, we're just going to review real quick. We talked about cloud computing at a high level. Well, from within DFARS, we looked at the security requirements, we looked at the incident reporting requirements, and we looked at the flow down requirements. And then we talked briefly about how CMMC will affect the overall compliancy between those two. Now, overall, what we're not trying to tell you is you can't use cloud. Cloud is definitely an option for various reasons. But what we're trying to specify and we're trying to point out here as well is the requirements that are here for compliancy should cause you as an organization to consider why you're using cloud. What are you planning on doing within that cloud? Can I do something locally or on my own systems instead to avoid all these additional requirements? Or do I have no choice, in which case then I'm going to do my best, or I'm going to do the utmost to find a cloud provider that satisfies my contractual obligations. That is the key with it. So when we think of those additional requirements and we go back up and look at the advantages, yes, these are all still true. But now under disadvantages, we have the concepts of risk. We have the concepts of potential contract violation. We have the concepts of potential fees and penalties, or potentially lawsuits because we're not fulfilling contractual obligations. Those all need to play a part within our risk factor when we're looking at cloud services and what we do with them. So at this time, we'll turn it over to questions. If there's any specific questions, Erin, I'll turn it back over to you to handle that, and we'll go ahead and get the questions answered.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate it. This is a really wonderful bit of information, and I appreciated the specific examples. I think Jean actually got a question that she's going to pose. She actually has a few of them, so I'm going to mute myself and let her make sure that she gets those lobbed your way.
Hey, Jeff. So the question that came in is, if using commercial email, does encryption cover requirements for DFARS in regard to transmitting data?
So encryption in email is one of those interesting ones. As part of the overall implementation for FedRAMP Moderate, FedRAMP Moderate does have the items that deal with encryption. And the encryptions that it says that communication to and from the entity in question, as well as during storage and processing, must be encrypted utilizing a FIPS 140-2 approved secure encryption methodology. So yes, encryption definitely plays a part in that. Now, what is FIPS 140-2? Well, FIPS 140-2 is a minimum level of encryption that NIST has specified an encryption protocol must reach in order to be reliant for DoD use. The key with that, though, is it says that it must be FIPS 140-2 authorized. And just like all the rest of this, there is a process that a company has to go through to validate that their encryption methodology is authorized. So in regards to communication, let's talk about secure file transfer. If we're looking at a service and they say, well, we're using secure file transfer and we're using our own custom encryption methodology. If they can't prove that that encryption methodology is FIPS 140-2 authorized, it's not applicable and it's not appropriate for within DFARS. Now, what we will commonly hear is, well, it's based off of one that is, so it's real close. That's not good enough. You're not using a FIPS 140-2 authorized encryption methodology. So yes, encryption definitely plays a part. Email is probably one of the more difficult concepts or one of the more costly concepts when we deal with cloud-based security and compliance, because it is very difficult unless you're looking at something like Office 365 within a GCC high environment to have an email system that fully meets both FedRAMP moderate as well as the DFARS requirements overall.
Jeff, for the DFARS, in terms of the DFARS requirements overall, isn't that the big sticking point there? It's not just that it meets the encryption requirement.
Yes, yes, that's the key with it. What we see happen frequently is people will focus on, or I shouldn't say people, but providers will focus on specific components. So we'll frequently hear, you can use our service, we're compliant with NIST 800-171. That's something we frequently hear. Now, that may sound good on the surface, but there's several things wrong with that statement. But the biggest one about it is the fact that NIST 800-171 doesn't deal with cloud. It deals with local premise. And more specifically, for you as a provider, well, that's good that they've gone through the process of reviewing NIST. However, where are they at with DFARS? Are they FedRAMP moderate? Do they handle the incident reporting requirements? And will they sign a flow-down agreement? All of those are what the key components are to say that this provider meets requirements for DFARS, and I'm still within compliancy by utilizing them.
Thanks. We do have another question that came in. More equipment is now coming to us as Industry 4.0, often with cloud connections. Can you speak to that?
Sure. The biggest aspect about that, and you're right, most Internet of Things or most Industry 4.0 items have some sort of cloud component. Now, the biggest aspect about this when we're looking through these really comes to the point of, and I'll bounce back to the slide just so I can actually show it to you. Is the key there is that the cloud service provider is used to store, process, or transmit covered defense information. If your Internet of Things device, for example, a sensor, or maybe I have a 3D printer, or maybe I'm using robotics of some sort, the question really becomes, is that Industry 4.0 or that Internet of Things device transmitting, processing, or storing covered defense information? And the answer is usually no. But if the answer is yes, then absolutely that has to be considered. What does the cloud end look like? Do they meet the DFARS requirements? If the answer is no, it does not have anything to do with CDI, well, then security is always a concern. However, if it doesn't meet the requirements, you're not in violation of the contract because that specific device does not handle CDI.
Okay, the next question is your recommendation that if a product is not FedRAMP authorized, they should not be used in general? The list on the FedRAMP website is not very extensive.
My advice in regarding that one is that is the best course of action. the best way to assure that a company has an equivalency is if they're actually authorized. But you're absolutely correct. The other item associated to that is chances are the services on that list probably cost more than one that isn't on that list. But when it comes to the regards to that, if it's a matter of I can't find a provider on that list that has my services, or I'd prefer to use this other service because it's cheaper, the consequences of that is now you have the obligation and you're burdening the risk to do the investigation to show that that organization actually has an equivalent FedRAMP model. And that's really where the line comes into play. If the organization can provide you that evidence, or if you have the resources or staff and time to do that internally, then definitely go that route. If you're unsure what that means, if you don't have the time, if you don't have the resources, if you're just kind of unsure if they truly are, then absolutely, it would be better to utilize somebody who's fully authorized because you know that they actually are FedRAMP moderate at that point. Now, again, I will also say with that, don't forget that the FedRAMP moderate portion is just one of the 3 requirements. Many of those organizations that are on that list are fully FedRAMP moderate. They're even FedRAMP high potentially. But that does not mean that the services they offer under that will honor the other 2 requirements. So that's just a portion of it. But yeah, definitely, I would first look for a solution on that list before I would look to a non-solution or someone who's not on that list.
Okay, do we have any other questions, Erin?
We do not. So
Okay.
I think that we are ready to wrap it up with great thanks. If we could pass it back to
Erin?
Jean. Yeah.
I do have one more question that popped in.
Excellent. Great.
Sorry. How would you investigate a managed service provider's ability to assist in maintaining compliance? Some organizations I have interviewed claim compliance.
The biggest aspect with that one, really, if I went back to the questions that we looked at, the answer to these questions really is where we look at that. And the solution to that one is, or the concept of that one is, the answer of yes, I am, or yes, we are, is not sufficient. Can they provide documentation and evidence accordingly? Now, we've run into a lot of situations where they can provide a very extensive system security plan. They can provide a very extensive security posture in general, and that's great. And by looking at that or reviewing that, it may be very similar to what FedRAMP requires. So in that situation, they're good. But maybe they can't produce a document for you that says that they will honor the incident reporting requirements. Maybe they're unwilling to sign a flow down agreement. Now, usually, honestly, when I talk with a company, the first one I start with is the last one there. Because if they won't sign a flow down agreement from me, I don't care whether they're FedRAMP moderate, and I don't care if they handle incident reporting. If they're willing to sign an agreement from me, then we can talk about the other 2. Now, a lot of companies or a lot of individuals will draft as part of their agreement statements that identify that this service provider guarantees and can provide evidence that they are FedRAMP moderate. And they also will guarantee and honor incident reporting requirements. That's a very valid method to do it. And for the most part, that will suffice for evidence in the fact that you have done your due diligence to make sure of that. Now, the flip side of that is it one and done? And the answer is no. Part of NIST 800-171 and part of DFARS requires a periodic review of your security posture. So if you're reviewing your internal security posture, say every 6 months, but you have a 3 to 5 year contract with your service or your cloud provider, and you have only ever done investigation initially, then you probably will get dinged by the DoD for not doing thorough investigation and ensuring that they're still compliant. The other one that we've seen happen in the past too is my cloud provider is actually using, we'll say, Amazon's GovCloud for their storage. Now, at that time, and based off of what they were configured with, they could be fully DFARS compliant. Do you have, or I would recommend though, that if there's not something in their agreements, that it be put in the agreements that said, if they ever change their back end, they will notify you. Because now this new back end may not meet the requirements. And Gene and I have been on several calls actually with companies where we've asked that. Well, you're using Amazon's GovCloud right now. Will you notify me? Or more importantly, will you reissue or let me out of my contract if you switch back ends? And their answer usually was no. In which case then, am I comfortable using that, knowing that at some point in the future, they may no longer be compliant, but yet I'm still contractually bound to use their service? Those are the type of things that we usually look for and the type of discussions that we have. Again, usually, always, the follow-up question is, will you, can you, do you? And then the follow-up is, provide me with the evidence that says it. I want it in writing that this applies to my contract, so that if an incident does occur, if DoD comes in to assess me, I have proof that you are taking the responsibility for these components of security. That will usually make most service providers or cloud providers think twice about trying to sell you services that aren't. It will also disqualify quite a few service providers if they come back and say, no, we won't do that. We've had that happen several times too. Yes, we are. Yes, we do. Great. Send me the evidence. Let me review it so that we can put it on file. And that's usually the last time we hear from those companies. So that's kind of where we look at it from that aspect.
Okay, I think that's the last question I've seen pop up, unless, Erin, you've seen one.
I have not.
Okay.
We're going to do a little switcheroo, I think, back to Jane's slides, just so that we can make sure that we remind you that your local MEP can help you. Jeff has given us a lot of really great things to consider about the will they, can they, do days, and the importance of going back again and again to prove that they will, they can, and they have been doing just that. If you need help with training, creating a system security plan, a plan of action with milestones, please reach out to NERDIC members that you see here or any other MEP resource as you go along, so we can help you move down that path and stay on that path towards compliance. Our other reminder is that we do have one more webinar in this series coming up. It is tentatively planned for October 13th, and it will feature a member of the CMMC AB, which is the CMMC Advisory Board. Jean, if you can advance and just show that date, that would be great. And I encourage folks that if you haven't registered, please do. While the date is perhaps a little bit tentative, as long as we have you on the registration list, you will be the first ones to know the details. So thank you very much for joining us today for this Polaris MEP sponsored by NERDIC webinar. If you have additional cybersecurity questions, please do reach out to Jean. And
thanks very much for Jeff for joining us today. We appreciate his time today and help. And if you have any questions, please give me a call. I'm happy to help you.
Thank you all very much. Have a good day.